The thing that I love about the UQ part is it's 100% general, right? Everyone struggles with the same problems. How many of you deal with like molecular simulations, atomistic systems? Maybe half, okay? So the things I'm going to talk about for the tutorial half are some of the models that we've developed in data sets and websites. So hopefully you get something out of either the visualization or the code or the fancy GNNs or something like that. But I couldn't find a way to hit 100% of the science and engineering audience with the demos that we have. So I'm sorry. If you're not doing simulations, you're going to be a little disappointed. Okay, so I talked about these leaderboards that we're running for the chemistry community. And it's been really, really exciting to see how quickly this field evolves. So in the upper left are some metrics. We want this number to be as low as possible over time for this leaderboard that we've been running. Every 3 to 6 months, there's a new model. The current one at the top of the leaderboard is this one called Equiformer V2, which I'll touch on really quickly. I think Tesh Schmidt is also going to give a little bit of a discussion about Equiformer. One of her students, Yilun, was really part of that work too. And a lot of this has been making these models larger, fancier, better representations, dihedrals, fancy ways of doing convolutions in spherical harmonic space. But the field is moving really quickly. And so just to give you an idea of qualitatively where we've come in the last 5 years. So on the left is what I would call a ground truth simulation. It's not perfect. If you do a fancier simulation, you will get slightly different results. I don't want to say that it's like the end all be all of computational chemistry or physics. But when we started, the models that had been released in 2017, and then when we released the data set in 2020, we trained, they were okay. The thing is not like blowing up, but they're also not doing the right thing. If you watch these closely, the surfaces are moving a little bit too far. These things are wiggling around. Qualitatively, they were not getting us the right answers. And what's been super amazing is just how steady the progress has been. There hasn't been like a single breakthrough in coming up with better representations. It's really been incremental, like people coming up with fancier things and scaling these things larger and larger. And so as one example, ESCN is a model that our group released last year. It was one of the ones I highlighted in the previous slide. Qualitatively, if you look at the movies on the right versus the ones on the left, it's starting to look pretty darn good. Like to my trained eye, I would say all of those are basically the same pathways. So we're starting to get to the point where these things are becoming more useful in the day-to-day. And that makes demos like I'm going to show more exciting. So all of this is on the website. And what I want you to do, so I have 3 little demos. The second one is actually going to be running some of the tutorials. This is mostly a way to show you that the tutorials actually run, and it is as simple as you say it is, because I've also put tutorials up before that are broken and or have errors. So I'm going to try and convince you all that this thing actually works. And so the second and third demo are going to actually use the tutorial codes. And so to prep for that, what I want you to do is I want you to go to fair-chem.github.io. And I want you to click on this link, open in GitHub Codespaces. How many of you have used GitHub Codespaces before? Basically, this is like a little free service that GitHub runs. You get like something like 120 core hours a month. That should be more than enough for this. If you happen to have run this in the past, then maybe you've already blown through your budget, and I'm sorry. The nice thing about Codespaces is basically it spins up a little virtual machine. And let me just show you exactly what's going to happen. It does the installation. I already have one. You should see a page that looks like that. And then it drops you into a VS Code terminal, where basically you can go and you can take a look at all of the tutorials as they're loading. This is going to take a second to start up. So it's still connecting. And then the other thing you can do is once this thing is started, it also includes JupyterLab. If any of you are more familiar with JupyterLab versus VS Code, I would say it's about a 50-50 among the people I work with. You can also just connect directly to the JupyterLab, and then this thing should be all good to go. I'll give this a second. This is popping up right away for me because I think I clicked the button like half an hour, 45 minutes ago, so it should already be running or it should pop up soon. The first time you click on this, there's a couple of really simple pip installs that have to happen. Like basically all of this is like deep learning stuff, the standard CUDA libraries. So it'll probably take 5 or 10 minutes to load on your machine, and then we'll do another live demo while that's running. So if you haven't, go to fair-chem, click on the button, get that started, and then hopefully it'll be ready to go by the time we finish the first demo. Sound good? Any questions? Okay, awesome. So while that is loading up, let's go ahead and do one that we don't have to wait for. So motivated by these examples, and again, it was really surprising in 2023, late 2022, that these things were starting to get as good as they were. We started to get excited enough that we said, we should really go ahead and start using this thing for the entire community, and we should make this as applicable as possible for everyone. And so we put up this website, open-catalyst.metademolab.com. Anyone in the world can go to this. Take a second to load. Seems like all the internet's just a little slow. Okay. This is basically a live demo. You can click on this. I'll walk through one of these examples. It basically exposes our latest, fanciest models so that anyone can play around with them for catalyst discovery. And this is really a demonstration of how robust the models are and how they are starting to become useful. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples where you can actually use this for something that would have been quite hard to do by hand a few years ago. Let me go back to the slides. So for those of you without a computational catalysis background, and I think that's probably most of you, if we're trying to come up with a catalyst that takes CO2 and turns it into something more valuable like ethanol or ethylene, that's like a, let's capture CO2 and then utilize it for something more valuable. We usually understand it with a reaction network where we take CO2 and then we do a bunch of steps, and then we come up with some intermediate, and then we do a bunch of steps, and eventually we end up with something like ethylene, which is pretty valuable and we actually want to produce. And a common side reaction might be we take water that's also around and we split the water to form hydrogen on the surface, and then that recombines to form hydrogen gas. And that's a pretty cool reaction if you're trying to make hydrogen for a fuel cell, but it's also a waste of electricity if you're trying to make ethylene. So you can boil down a lot of computational catalysis to basically, what are the energies of descriptors like these? And it's a surprisingly simple but surprisingly powerful way of understanding what a catalyst is going to do. So for CO2 electrochemistry, this is figures from a paper that we wrote in 2020 in Nature. One axis is the hydrogen absorption energy, another is the CO absorption energy. There's others that you could choose, but these are two of the common ones. And basically what this is saying is, I want the CO absorption energies to be less than 0, but not too negative. And that's sort of like a Goldilocks principle. I want to take the CO2 and do something with it, but I don't want it to be so strong that it sticks around forever and then poisons my surface and then shuts down. So I want it to be in this sort of band around -0.6. And then the hydrogen one is basically saying, I really don't want to just make hydrogen on the surface. So ideally, I would have as little hydrogen there as possible. So I want this thing to be all the way to the right. And so this little band is basically saying, I want to find materials with a CO absorption energy of around -0.6 or -0.7. And I want the hydrogen one to be as positive as possible. And then the one on the right is saying, this is CO activity versus activity. This is saying if I'm over here, I make only valuable things with my CO2. I'm not wasting it on hydrogen. Okay, really, really simple, 2 descriptors in and 2 things out that we want to care about. This is the region that we want to be. So far, so good. Yeah.
Have we considered thermal correction like entropy? Or just direct on the energy?
Yeah, it's a great question. These are very simple descriptors. There's no entropy or free energy involved.
Okay.
The entropy and free energy comes into the thing that makes this map. So the color is a microkinetic model that has the entropy and the free energy inside of it. The actual descriptors here have no vibrational corrections. It's a little bit nuanced, but like basically this is as simple as possible. And then all of the hard stuff is within the thing that makes that model. Yeah. Okay. So I show this because a embarrassingly large amount of computational catalysis is papers that are like this, where you're trying to predict what are the descriptors for this next set of catalysts that I'm interested in trying to find. So as an example, and this is where it's always fun to see if live demo works. Copper is one of the ones that is most well known for CO2 electroreduction. And if you notice, it is a pure metal that happens, it's a little fuzzy. It's a pure metal that happens to sit in this Goldilocks region. The hydrogen is like somewhere around 0 or so. And then the CO binding energy is around minus 0.5, minus 0.6 or so. And so that is a hand-wavy explanation for why copper is the only experimental single component catalyst that takes appreciable amounts of CO2 and turns into something valuable. So let's just see if we can reproduce this. So if you want to follow along on your computer, feel free to go to the Open Catalyst demo. The website is open-catalyst.metademolab.com. And then when you click on demo, it just adds the /demo, and then it takes you to this little input. We've preloaded this thing with all of the stable inorganic materials from the materials project. I'm interested in copper, so let's go ahead and run that. I click next. In catalysis, we're interested in facets of these materials. So these are basically different surfaces that you can get. You can get a flat surface. You can get a step surface. These are all different possibilities for different reaction sites where something might come in and bind and react. These are all possibilities. And so I'm going to look for the copper 211. These steps are known to be quite interesting for CO2 electroreduction. If you ask a computational catalysis person, where is the CO2 reduction happening? It's probably along this step. I only know that because I have done a lot of these calculations on copper. And so I've just done these in the past. But you can choose whichever one of these you want. If you want to try something other than copper 211, feel free to select something else. We've also pre-computed a bunch of different adsorbates that we think are interesting. I'm going to select CO. This thing is a global optimization problem. Basically, we're trying to find the best possible way to place CO on the surface. And that global optimum structure and its energy is what we would call the adsorption energy. And so these are all different ways that you can place a CO on a surface. There are 16 pages of these things. See if that comes back. Maybe not. Those are all different configurations that we might want to consider. And that's one of the things that makes this field so complicated, is that in order to solve the problem, we have to do many, many, many different local minima and then find the best one. And on a corrugated surface, let me just run this again real quick, just so I can get the link. Here, CO. This is basically me just double checking. This is one of the two fancy models that we've preloaded on this demo. This thing is now running on a bunch of GPUs on AWS. It usually takes about like between 1 and 3 minutes for this to run in practice. Every one of these is a GPU accelerated relaxation using one of our fancy GNNs like Equiformer to basically try and optimize the structure. If all of you go and you try and hit it at the same time, the queue is finite. So it will start to slow down a little bit and then it will clear. We have, I forget exactly what the number of GPUs was. It was not like a massive number. There's not too often that we go into a room of 100 people and tell them all to click the button at the same time. There are, I think, a couple of labs that are starting to use this as part of their workflows. We don't collect any data here, so we have no idea who's using this. All we know is the total number of people who push the button per second. So we can see these little spikes or whatever is happening, but we don't actually know who around the world is doing it. So this is going to take a couple of minutes. It's on you to basically refresh this every once in a while. The link that shows up is permanent. So once this thing runs, you can always come back to it and look at the results. It also means that you can come back to this in an hour, and even if the results aren't here yet, eventually, if you refresh this website, it should just work. Any questions so far? How many of you have actually clicked the run model so far? Oh, no. I hate it when people follow the instructions. Okay, so these are a couple that I ran this morning, just because I was worried that this was gonna happen and you guys were gonna do what I asked. So, CO and copper, this is one that I ran around 11. Everything should pop up in a second. The number for this should be about, I think, minus 0.7. It says the best place to absorb this thing is right where I thought it was gonna be. It's right on top of one of these steps. So I would call that pretty close to the one that I would have gotten if I had run DFT. This number is a little bit lower than I expected, a little lower than the one that I had in the previous. So I would say usually DFT error is usually like on the order of like 0.1. If you hand it to the same person and use two slightly different sets of convergence settings, usually it wiggles by about that much. So I'm not too worried about minus 0.77 versus minus 0.6. But probably if we were a little bit more careful, we could narrow that down and figure out exactly where is that noise coming from. If I do the same thing with hydrogen, just to convince you that these numbers are not always minus 0.7. So this one should also pop up. This one's minus 0.1. That's also pretty close to where it should be. Basically, it's saying that hydrogen binds a lot weaker than CO. So far, so good? Okay. And again, I can't stress this enough. Having done these calculations by hand, to actually try a whole bunch of these and then let a computer run overnight, every single one of these local optimizations is something like 2 days on a fast server. And you often have to do 5 or 10 or 100 configurations in order to find the best one. And so this looks like a 3-minute call now, but like really this is like some poor graduate student like me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever the number is, basically babysitting these calculations, trying to get them to converge. These are also the simplest ones. CO sitting on a surface is like as easy as it gets. There's like no internal degrees of freedom. You just like, it's going to sit straight up. So let's do one that's a little bit more interesting. Have any of you gotten actual results yet? Like refreshed and got anything? The first person to get something, raise your hand and let me know. Oh, there's at least one. You were the one who clicked the button the first.
Yes, actually, I'm studying like a water absorption on the platinum surface, not the exact thing.
Even better. I'm glad you're using it. Okay. They should be about the same computational cost. I don't think there's anything intrinsically faster about water and platinum. Okay. So those were a couple of really simple ones. If you actually want to understand how these things react, it's not just like one of these simple adsorbates, but you want to do many, many, many different reactions. And so this is a hypothetical one that I worked on when I was a postdoc. It's a relatively simple network. There's like 100 intermediates and a couple of hundred reactions. This is the sort of thing that you would do so that you could understand why the surface is making acetaldehyde and not water or methanol or something else. Again, it is on an expert to basically go through and do these by hand for the most part. And one of my friends in the community, Karsten Reuter, who's at the Fritz Haber Institute, basically published a paper in 2023 saying this paper that we had written back in 2017 was not quite perfect. Actually, there were some mistakes, not terrible ones, but basically we had said that there was one configuration that had an energy, but actually Karsten was very clever and he was able to come up with some better configurations with a global search method in order to do this. This slide also looks very simple. Every single one of these is a couple of nodes running for a couple of days, and there's many. So this slide is, I would estimate something like 20,000 CPU hours of DFT in order to run. Again, very, very expensive. So what I want you to do, if you have the time, is to go through and try and get a rhodium 111 or rhodium 211 surface. I'm going to do this one only because I've done it in the past and I know that it's the one that he told me was wrong. And so I always like to pick on that as something that we can do now very fast. I'm going to do CH3, CHOH, but if you want to pick one of these other ones, let's see another one that's different. He's also claiming CH3CO on rhodium 111 should be different. If you want to pick one that works, for example, he's claiming CH, you should get just about the same number, like minus 1.6 or so. I'm just going to go to this demo. Again, pretty much the same flow. Rhodium. And I think it was the 211. Yeah. a little annoying to get through this. One of the things that was on their wish list for this demo when we first made it was we really wanted a little visualization so that we could see these little adsorbates. So CHOH, CH3, where is it? There we go. So this was the paper that AJ and I had written in 2017. That was the orientation that we had found. Let's go and find this thing. These all look like the same molecule. These are all different ways that we can place it. This one is more interesting because there's more degrees of freedom. I can rotate this thing around. I can like wiggle it, right? There's more interesting degrees of freedom than with the CO case. I'll go ahead and run this. This one will also take a few minutes. I'll come back to it. Let's see if any of the other ones ran. Mine's still running. Probably everyone's stuck in queue. If you do this, again, this was me at 11 a.m. this morning. CHOH-CH3 minus 3.5 for EV. And if we look at the one that Karsten was doing, this was Karsten being very clever with his own global optimization thing. He says, actually, if you can align this thing along the step, you can get minus 3.6, and that energy is a little bit better. And if we go and look at the one that I just loaded, you see a little bit of, this is a periodic boundary condition repeat. These things go off the side, but the CO is also along the step. And so the number is basically spot on. It's the right configuration. Carson had to train a model from scratch in order to basically get this. It was basically like a Bayesian optimization, active learning. How can I do the right DFT? But I'm showing this example because we're now sort of at the point where these models are generalizable enough that we can just use these things with no additional DFT and get answers that we think are quite reasonable. Yeah.
I'm just curious, so like searching for the configuration, so have you compared with the current results like with other similar choice, like by the initial molecular dynamics and the by CV2K, does the result say are similar to this? Would that be?
There's all sorts of global optimization techniques you can use here. So you can anneal it, you can raise the temperature, then reduce the temperature. You can use Monte Carlo, you can run long time scale MD. All of those are just ways of like sampling many configurations to find the best one. As far as no, there aren't better ones than this current one, but that's not a hard guarantee. Actually, if you look very carefully, sometimes there's some small changes like in how this OH rotation goes around. So that's one subtlety that like there's a couple of energies that are basically the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, any questions on this? Again, the point of this demo is basically just like, we're getting to the point now where some of these models are working so good that you can just ask them for predictions on some of these surfaces and just use them without needing additional data. And I'm just showing this because when I started in this area 7 years ago, that was not the assumption. The assumption was we were always going to be active learning, adding more data. And so this is pretty cool. Yeah.
So why is the mistake is made at that time, but right now it changed?
Yeah, the mistake was AJ was a human with a finite amount of interest in running different calculations, and AJ had an automated way of at the time he was also like quite far ahead of his time. He had a tight binding model, which is a reduced a cheaper computational model that he could basically let this thing bounce around and then try and collect some of those minimum, and then he would run those. And I would say that is like good on him for not just trying to choose a few by hand. He was actually trying to come up with a method to sample more configurations. But either he didn't run that thing long enough, or the type binding didn't agree that that was a local minima. And so he never ran the right calculation here. These are basically the same level of theory. It's not like the computational physics was wrong. It's not like the underlying functional was wrong. It was just he didn't guess the right local minimum and do an optimization that dropped into it. Does that make sense? And like, to be frank, this is also something that is probably indicative of a whole bunch of papers in computational catalysis. Like these aren't like massive errors. It's not like I'm saying all of computational catalysis is nonsense, right? Someone actually did a pretty good job. He got close. But when the state of the art is a student running calculations by hand and then going to your advisor and saying, is this the best one? Or do you think there's anything wrong? And someone saying, did you try this other one? It's really hard to do that rigorously in high throughput. But nonetheless, that is what the field is based on right now. And the field is based that way because every one of these is so expensive that you really babysit the calculations and you run them because you didn't have resources to do many of these at the same time. Does that make sense?
So with this demo lab, do you think all this kind of calculations could be more accurate?
I think that's one outcome here. You can either think about how to make this faster for coming up with a new reaction network from scratch. And we're already starting to see some other people around the world start to use that in these on-the-fly microkinetic model reaction mechanism generation schemes. So that's one. Basically, how would I get this answer without doing any calculations really fast? The second one is, how do I make things more accurate? Just to get better numbers whenever I have a new thing moving forward. This is what we use in practice for our own things. When we're trying to screen or discover some new material, we use an approach like this. Usually what we do is we also do a little single point at the end. We just do one verification simulation, which takes about usually like 20 minutes or an hour just to verify the final number and get the actual number from the code and make sure we have a local minimum. But we're using the methods in order to say what is the best configuration and also find a local minimum versus letting this thing settle down on its own with some sort of fancy simulation. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how's the accuracy of the demo? Is that same as the simulation?
If you're willing to do a DFT single point in the end, it's something like 1,000 times faster than if you're brute forcing it. And it's something like 90% of the time you get the same answer as you would have with DFT brute force within like 0.1 EV or so. But there's a paper at ZorbML that we released where basically we came up with a new validation data set to show that that was the case. I'm happy to send you the link to that afterwards. But basically, before we put this up online, we wanted to be careful. And so we released the paper first with the statistics, and then because the stats were pretty good, we released the demo. Yeah. Okay, so in the interest of time, let's move on to one of the examples from the tutorial. Tutorial data. And I tried to pick one that I thought was fairly general, because I know that most of you are not computational catalysis people, so this might be a fun demo, but like you're not actually going to run this in your day-to-day afterwards or in your free time or instead of reading a book or something. So one thing that I think is quite useful is the models that we've released, the representations are already quite helpful in other domains. And the models themselves are quite interesting. So we've put all this work into coming up with fancy models for catalyst systems, things like Equiformer and GenNetOC and other things like that. Those models are also quite useful outside of catalysis. And again, the checkpoints themselves are also useful. So we've seen this in a couple of cases. So as one example, this was a paper I worked on with Sam Blau, who's a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Sam doesn't really care about heterogeneous catalysts. He's wrong, but I won't tell him that. He likes these things called transition metal complexes. There's these metal centers with these ligands associated with them. These are different class of systems, but they're more close to like what you would see inside of an enzyme. Aditya is really an expert in this area. If you have hard questions, ask Aditya. We built another data set called TM. There was a separate data set called TMQM with a bunch of these things pre-relaxed with another computational chemistry code and then a fancy level of theory. I was working with Sam. We basically realized that there were some convergence problems, so we released a follow-up data set. We also wanted to build some ML models. And so there was an undergrad in my group who's now at MIT doing his PhD. He basically tried a few of these different models that we had released for the Open Catalyst project. And we wanted to find the ones that were most accurate. And one of the really interesting things from this was, one, models that worked well for heterogeneous catalysts also worked well for these transition metal complexes. That was not obvious to us. It could have been that like we were over optimizing for some architecture for heterogeneous metal surfaces, but that wasn't the case. But what was even more interesting was this observation. In the paper, you can find two comparisons at the end, where basically he takes a model that was trained from scratch using one of the latest models, And then he compared it to a model that he did exactly the same thing. He just loaded the checkpoint from the heterogeneous catalyst first and then fine-tuned on top of that. Embarrassingly simple. There's like a million ways you can do this better, like play with the fine-tuning rates or like what you freeze or unfreeze. Like the field is completely open on what the right way to fine-tune a deep learning model is. But nonetheless, like just dropping in one of our checkpoints, the MAE dropped by like 25 or 30%. And so this was also fascinating. It says that the representations that were learned in the heterogeneous space are useful in very different areas as well, which again didn't have to be that way. We were sort of worried that like we were going to have to come up with new data sets continuously for the rest of our lives to cover all of chemistry, but actually it seems like there's a little bit of transferability. So this is one example that I got really excited about. Another example that I was excited about, there's a professor at the University of Copenhagen, Jan Rasmussen, who is really famous in electrochemistry for, he leads the Center on High Entropy Alloy Catalysts. And so these high entropy alloys are basically, in the open catalyst demo, there are these ordered intermetallic structures. They're basically locked into place. And the definition of a solid solution is everything is sitting on a lattice and you're swapping them in and out. So you know that on the whole, it's 50-50 nickel and platinum or whatever that is, copper, palladium, but it's a random ordering on this lattice. That's the definition of a solid solution. And this class of materials called high entropy alloys is really interesting because you have so many components, and usually the definition of a high entropy alloy is usually more than 4, often like 5 or 6 different components that you mix together. There's so many ways that you can mix and match 5 things on a lattice that it really, 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 really wants to be a solid solution. The entropy that you get from all those orderings is enough to make it be a solid solution, which is fascinating. So this was another example where Jan sent one of his PhD students to my group when I was at Carnegie Mellon. He was going to spend 3 months. Basically, the assumption was that they were going to need to train a new data set for the solid solution materials. And the assumption that we had made that things were ordered were not going to work. But if you go and you read this paper, basically he shows that the models basically out of the box can predict OH binding energies on these high entropy alloys just about as accurately as on these ordered intermetallics, which again is fascinating. Like I had made an assumption that we were going to need to make more data sets for solid solutions and HEAs in the future. And I kept on punting it because I really didn't want to make another data set. And then the student came along and showed us like, actually, the models work just fine. Solid solutions, you can already understand from what we have. So I'm mentioning these 2 cases because like, these are not the only ones I've seen, but like the number that we've seen where people have just used our checkpoints or our models and gotten better results is increasing. And the number one assumption I make when I go around and chat with friends now is like, if you're training some sort of potential on your own stuff, like just try downloading one of ours as a starting point and try training it. And if it works, awesome. If it doesn't, let us know. You can always optimize further with the fine-tuning strategy. So I'm going to walk through one of these examples. So this is fine-tuning a model. Basically, this was a example that John Kitchen, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote a paper on these oxide polymorphs several years ago. This was back in 2015. And he collected some data. He was doing the right thing. He posted all the data online in a way that was easy to use. And basically, if you go through, you can load one of our models. This is a particular checkpoint that was trained on OC20 and OC22, a bunch of metals and a bunch of oxide systems. You can use this little command to basically download the latest checkpoint locally. And then you can also grab the supporting info from his paper, and you can see all the messy details of exactly what he did in order to get there. And let me just jump to some of the results. If you do a comparison between what he got when he ran these calculations in 2015 and what we got from one of our checkpoints, you can see that a whole bunch of these materials look pretty good along the parity, but a couple of these are not doing amazing. I don't know exactly what's wrong. If you look at one of the energy profiles, it seems that there's some sort of systematic shift. Like what we consider to be zero for vanadium oxide is not what he considers to be zero, so there's something systematically wrong. But I would say this is probably indicative of a lot of people just randomly pulling one of our models. It's hard to be 100% consistent, and probably if you're using this for your own data, there's going to be something that we did differently than you that you're going to basically need to adapt to. So it's a little bit, it's a little simple, but I think it's also representative of how people might use these. So if you want to do this, there's a couple of steps. One, you basically go through and make an ASE/DB. How many of you know what ASE is? How many of you are doing molecular simulations and do not know what ASE is? A couple, okay. ASE is atomic simulation environment. It's basically just a Python package that people agreed, what does it mean to be a molecular structure? And what is a way of connecting with different electronic structure calculations? Like if I want to run a calculation with my favorite code, like we often use fast, but quantum espresso is another possibility, or Gaussian, or I don't know what other your favorite ones are. It's basically just an abstraction that allows you to share the formats. So it's something that we use when we're trying to share things between groups. So you make one of these little ASE/DBs, you go ahead and you attach little calculators with the results. This is now a little file that has a whole list of oxide calculations that John had in his supporting info. There's 295 structures. You always do train validation tests so that you can figure out the right fine-tuning rates and everything else. So this is just a little thing to split it into train validation tests. There's a little helper tutorial. You specify all the configurations. So most of this is basically just saying we're going to load our prior model, but we're going to use a new database for the train and the test and the validation data. And we want to train on the energies and the forces. So this is just telling our model really explicitly what we want this thing to do. Write a little config file. These are all the different details. And again, these models are complicated. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do this, but most of this is just coming from the checkpoint that we have online. And then if you go and you run this thing, eventually you get to the point where you can see that this thing is working quite a bit better for the structures that we're doing bad. It's also messed up a couple of other things. This is not a perfectly converged one. The reason why we didn't run this thing to convergence is it's really easy for us to change the code and break the tutorials. And so actually what you're seeing is code that runs every single time someone changes a repository now. We rerun all the tutorial examples to make sure that it actually gets the same results and we don't introduce random errors. And so we tried to keep this to like 20 minutes of fine tuning on just a CPU without a GPU. If you have a GPU available, you can do much better than this and get this thing to converge cleanly. And so if you look at the error originally, the error starts at around 1.7 EV per atom mean absolute error. And with just, I don't know, 10 or 20 minutes on 2 cores, you can get down to something like 0.8. It's still not great. This is the same example. These two should be overlapping. Again, we just didn't run long enough for this thing to get perfect. So let me just show real quick. And again, this is mostly a convince you that this is a real tutorial and not just a cooked up example. Let's go ahead and reconnect. See if we can find this. Also see. Let's think that. We'll give this another few minutes. Anyways, if you go to this code space, in there should be a little core tutorial section. If you click on that thing and run all cells inside of one of those notebooks, it should perfectly reproduce the one that I just showed you, because again, the thing that's running on GitHub is exactly the code that I showed you. It runs continuously every day whenever the things update. Any questions on this? Like how to fine tune these models or how to use these? This also gets at like sort of a more philosophical question of my view of the future is that nobody trains their own models from scratch in the simulation community. Like my copper is your copper, and we probably don't need to learn representations every time. And so I'm showing this example also because I am personally convinced that in the next few years, increasingly, this is going to be the way that we do research is you load your favorite checkpoint or load your favorite base model, and then you tune it for your own thing. And again, that's not wildly creative. If you look at the image or language processing communities, right, that's sort of the standard, but that's not the way it's been in the chemistry space. How many people have tried something like this? Like, how many of you have used someone else's checkpoint as a starting point? Like, is that already I see a couple. Yeah, and what has been your like, not to call out your favorite or least favorite checkpoints, but like so far, is that something that like you're actually using in the current day-to-day, or where do you?
Current day-to-day, yeah,
That's good.
some of the embeddings are used as checkpoints, yeah.
Yeah. Other people? There were a couple of other hands. What else are people using these things for? Everyone's research is top secret. Okay, okay, I won't call anyone else out. But basically, again, like, maybe just to stress another couple of points that makes this really exciting. Another benefit of doing things this way is that all of the complexity in, let me see if I can find the example. These models are super complicated. There's all sorts of things that you can tune, like what the right number of layers is, right embedding sizes, how many hidden features, what the training strategy is. All of those are super hard to converge and hard to get right the first time you train one of these models. But once someone has already done the hard work of getting one of these things to train, usually things are much more robust afterwards. So like, you've already gone through the process of finding a reasonably good global minimum in parameter space, and someone has already made a bunch of the decisions here for you that you can always tweak afterwards. My impression has been that this also wildly cuts down the amount of like tweaking that you have to do in order to get one of these things to train from scratch. That's another reason for doing this. Okay, as one more example of something that's a little bit more researchy, and again, feel free to run these things afterwards in your own time. If I go to this one, another area where we've seen really cool generalization is in transition state calculations. So on the left is sort of this global optimum. This is the Open Catalyst demo. It's just trying to find the best minimum on a surface. But if you go to your favorite computational chemistry researcher and you ask, what do you actually spend your time doing if you're doing reactions? It is trying to optimize transition state paths between different local minimum. And this is a really, really expensive calculation now. These are usually a factor of 10 to 100 times more expensive than the global optimizations that I showed before. So people spend a lot of time on this. So Brooke Wander is a PhD student at CMU. We put this paper up on arXiv this spring. In a similar vein of trying to be careful before we release a new method online, we, her internship last summer at Meta actually started, we again made an assumption that we were going to need another data set. Like, our models had only seen these local minimum. So we sort of assumed that we were going to have to do more transition state calculations to build another training data set, to build another training model that we could then release that other people would be able to use. And so Brooke's internship started with making this OC20 NAB validation data set. We originally thought it was going to be a training data set, but it turned out we could just use this as validation. And basically, a similar strategy works really well in this case. If you just take one of our pre-trained checkpoints that are already available online and you do a optimization, try and find the transition state between the 2 points, you get something like a 2200-fold speed up, and you get the same answer as you would have gotten with DFT 70% of the time. 70% is pretty good, like zero shot, no additional data. That's already pretty exciting. If you're willing to do a couple of single points, like just to verify the energies, you can get down to something like 100-fold speed up and 85%, and then several-fold speed up if you're doing more and more DFT calculations. And a lot of these pathways look really close to what you would have gotten with DFT. So this is an example of a little molecule desorbing from a surface. Pathways are basically perfect, no additional DFT. This is an example of a dissociation. Also looks pretty darn good. This is like an OH dissociating on the surface. There's a little bit of a shift, but on the whole, the energy looks like it should. This is a transfer reaction. There's a hydrogen jumping from one adsorbate on the surface to another adsorbate. Also an example where it seems like these things tend to work pretty well. Anyone who's tried to run these things by hand also knows how annoying it is to get these things to converge. Even with just like DFT as a base, numerically, these things are not very stable. So it's hard to get these results. As I said, this is also the sort of thing that you would want to do for reaction networks. So you can basically go back to that same example that I showed before and say that actually, if you were being careful and you had run DFT pathways for everything, you would have gotten slightly different mechanistic results. So I forget who asked the question, but are we going to be able to get better answers than we were getting before? I think the answer is also yes here too. And the transition state calculations, the approximations that people make in order to make those things feasible are really embarrassingly simple. Like they draw a straight line through a curve and assume the straight line holds forever. That is like the current state of the art in computational catalysis. And so we are moving beyond that very quickly. So as one final example, if you go to this, you can see there's now our Cat Tsunami tutorial 2. This basically helps with automating 2 steps. And if you run start to finish, it should run. It basically does a whole bunch of different enumerations of the starting and final configurations. So it helps you get reasonable guesses of what the best pathway on the surface is going to be. So this is CH, a CH molecule breaking apart into a C and a hydrogen sitting on a surface. For every one of these, you basically just run local optimizations. You enumerate all of the different ways that you can go between those states. And then you run little GPU accelerated relaxations. If you run this on your code space, it's going to take a while. I think it's about an hour and a half if you run this example start to finish. If you have a GPU, this runs way faster. And at the end, you can get a result that's pretty close to what you would have gotten if you were just doing CH association by hand. And again, I'm just showing this because we're getting to the point now where the zero-shot evaluation of these models is getting about as good as someone doing it by hand. And so does anyone actually run transition state NEB calculations by hand in their day-to-day? A couple, right? The computational chemistry people who I've already chatted with. But again, the people who are running these things, like we're getting close to the point where we can actually use them. Anyone have a question on this? If most of you are not actually running NEBs, I'm not going to force you to go through the details there. But again, trust me, these things are annoying and slow, and they're now much faster. Other questions on these demos? Are there any questions on like how we set up the demos or the websites or the any other questions about the models? I sort of brushed over all the details on these equivariant GNNs and everything else we're doing. Yeah.
Do you have any insights on why is that generalizable to the out of distribution or out of task you are trained on? Like, so I'm wondering what task it will fail and what task it will succeed to like fine tune, or do you have any like previous research to understand what that pre-trained really learns, like about physics or?
Yeah, I think this gets back to sort of philosophical questions of how do you prove that your model has done the right thing and learned some physics? And I don't know how to rigorously prove that. What we have done so far is like when we first put these data sets online, we were already thinking about how we wanted people to start to extrapolate or domain shift or whatever you want to call it. And so if you look at the test split on the website, there's already 4 different test splits. So for example, one of them is an adsorbate that you've never seen before. So there's like 80 small molecules. Let's pick 10 and we won't show them to anyone, but you have to predict what's going to happen. Or outer domain catalyst is a combination of metals for the catalyst that we've never seen before. And if you look at the first models in this, like the very first ones we were training back in like 2020, a lot of these, if you look at them, 0.78, 0.8. Not only are the numbers bad, but if you look at them, they're also quite a bit better in domain versus outer domain. And I have another plot that I can show you. I can send you an email afterwards. The first models we were training, like the outer domain errors were quite a bit higher. And that's not a surprise. We sort of assumed that that was going to be the case. But somewhere around GemNet-OC, all of a sudden these things started to be flat. And so if you look at the GemNet-OC papers and the things afterwards, there's something about the representation that is learned in those later models that a new adsorbate or a new composition is now considered in domain, and you get basically the same errors as you were seeing before. And so I don't know how to prove that. I don't know how to prove that it's learning physics. Again, if any of you have an idea on what else we should be doing here, I'm open to it. But by tracking these outer domain metrics, we were able to see that happen, and then that's when we got excited. And I'm mentioning that also because if we hadn't have done that, if we had only released a in-domain equivalent, the same random choices, we wouldn't have realized that the models were even doing this, and that's something exciting had happened. Like, frankly, I didn't believe the results for the GenNet-OC paper. Like, I asked the student who was working on it, Mohammed, and a couple of others to rerun the validation like 3 or 4 times, because he kept on coming back and saying that it was the same. And I kept on saying, like, there's no way that it's the same for these other splits. But yeah, I don't know why the representation is working the way it is. These models have hundreds of millions of parameters. Like the small one, a smaller performer is 30 million, the big one is 150 million. We have a paper online that does a billion scale for GNNs. Like, model explainability is really hard when you have that many parameters, right? It's a problem everywhere. Other questions? This is also the point where I remind you that if any of this is not clear, and this looks complicated, or you want to know how this works, you should ask Tess when she comes and talks. And she can tell you all the answers. Okay, if there's no more questions, I think we can end there. I'll be around. Feel free to come up today or anytime else in the workshop, and we can have some more chats. This has been fun.
There are no questions in the Zoom, so if anybody else has questions.
Maybe I have some question. How much does Meta care about this question?
Explainability?
Like the questions that are being asked about, are you learning physics from it or something? And Meta, I guess on your team.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think this is sorry, I should put the microphone back on, I guess. I think it's a really good question. So on our team, we have about 15 people. About 2/3 of the people are machine learning, software engineering background, very smart people who know a lot of linear algebra and have picked up quite a bit of chemistry by having lots of discussions, but like not actually coming from a research background in that area. And about 1/3, about 5 people with a material science, chemistry, chemical engineering background, sort of like me. And I mention that because one of the fun things about working with people from another domain is that they're going to come with their own biases and ways of doing things. And if you ask someone from a computer vision background, what's the best way to try and improve models? Like the lessons that were learned there were basically some symmetries are useful, not all symmetries are. Like translational invariance in your models is usually a very good thing to have, so you use convolutional neural networks. But rotational symmetry is often sort of expensive. And so if you look at the image people, like there are models that are rotationally invariant, equivariant, whatever you care about. But most people just get that through data augmentation because it's faster and it's better to scale the models larger. And so quite a few of the models we've trained, we have relaxed some of the assumptions in order to make the models bigger. And by making the models bigger and giving them more capacity to learn from these hundreds of millions of configurations, the models have become interesting and started to generalize and do fun things. But sometimes you lose things along the way by relaxing some of these symmetries. And so I have become more flexible over time in saying if someone else wants to run an experiment and try something cool, then I'm open to seeing the data. And afterwards, we can ask what's the best way to add the symmetries or other things back or find other ways to make it work. But sometimes you see results that are surprising. And so one example is some of the models, we've relaxed some of the fancy symmetries that other people have done. And I'm also mentioning this because I was at a workshop at Berkeley at the Simons Institute where quite a few groups had sort of noticed similar things, like if you incorporate all of the inductive biases that you think are interesting, sometimes it makes the models hard to train or slow. And actually, you can get some benefits by relaxing some of those. Another thing that we've done is in these models, we've relaxed energy conservation. We have a model that predicts the force, which should be the gradient of the energy as a vector. And there's another head that predicts the energy. And that's like a little weird. Like really the force should just be the gradient of the energy. But nonetheless, if you decouple those two, you can make the models way faster. You can use mixed precision inside of the model. You can make a lot of the steps way faster than they would otherwise be. And so, and that's another situation where like, I was a little surprised to see those models do as well as they have. But nonetheless, those are the ways that we get the best models right now. And so it's an interesting research question. So it's a mixed bag. But like when you go and you work with these other people, like they all have their own interests and excitements. And that's part of what also leads to them doing something creative that you wouldn't have done if, like I just been sitting in my own office at CMU and the engineering department, I would have done things a different way. But again, that's research, that's fun. That's like the benefit of bringing lots of people together. Yeah, other questions? That's a little philosophical. I'm like, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any like general weaknesses within your model?
Our models are the best models. Yeah, weaknesses. I would say that like energy conservation one has been a little bit weird. We've been like bringing things back together and making it so that we can train the latest ones with energy conservation back on, but that's like still a research area. There's a couple of new people on the team who are really excited about that. That's one. Another one, these models are slow to train. Not surprising if you have 100 million parameters. Like if you look at our papers, often it's, as I mentioned, 1,000 GPU days. That's like 128 GPUs training for a week. That's like when I talk to other people within FAIR, they like to remind me that that's like a very small, simple model compared to like the image language people. So like we don't even like register as a blip when it comes to training these big models. But from a chemistry background, that feels very large. I'm used to like models with like thousands of parameters. So if you're used to training things super fast and stuff converging within an hour, like that's not these models. They will be slow. They are very large. They can train with big data sets, and that also makes them a little more expensive. Inference time is also a bit slower. If you have 100 million parameters, like it's hard to do that many things on a GPU. So it takes like 100 milliseconds for one of our models in a forward pass. 100 milliseconds is way faster than an hour for a DFT calculation, but it is way slower than a classical microdynamics potential, which could be like microseconds to milliseconds if you've optimized everything. Yeah, those are the obvious ones.
Cool. If there are no other questions, let's thank Zach again for.